Imagine waking up one morning and seeing a $500,000 dock being built right in the middle of your private lake. No permission, no heads up. Just some HOA president who thinks she owns everything, even the water passed down from my grandfather. She's building a $5 million cabin on my land and didn't even ask. I knew I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. You think someone like that would back down? Well, maybe not. But what happens next? You won't believe it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you think. I'm Wyatt McAllister, 39 years old, and I retired early from designing log cabins after selling my engineering firm for more money than I ever thought I'd see in one lifetime. Now, I live alone by a private lake I inherited from my grandfather, way out in the countryside, where the nearest neighbor is a good half-mile away. My life is simple these days. I fish when I want to fish, I read books when I want to read, and I enjoy the kind of peace and quiet that most people only dream about. Or at least that's how things used to be. Because one morning in late spring, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling across the lake from me. Not just any machinery either. We're talking bulldozers, excavators, and what sounded like a small army of construction workers shouting orders back and forth. I stumbled out of bed, threw on some clothes, and walked outside to see what in the world was happening to my perfect little sanctuary. What I saw made absolutely no sense at first. A $500,000 dock had appeared on my lake. For a moment I thought I was hallucinating. I blinked, stepped closer, but the damn thing was still there, glinting in the sun like it belonged. On my lake. And I'm not talking about some little fishing pier here. This thing was enormous, easily 100 feet long and 20 feet wide with multiple levels, and what looked like enough space to park a yacht. The whole structure was being built, with expensive materials too. Treated hardwood decking, stainless steel railings, the kind of craftsmanship that probably cost more per square foot than most people's entire houses. I stood there in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, just staring at this thing, taking shape in what I'd always considered my private water. The noise was incredible. The peaceful morning sounds of birds and gentle water lapping against the shore were completely drowned out by diesel engines. I remember thinking to myself, what on earth is that thing doing in my lake? Because, make no mistake about it, this wasn't some public waterway we're talking about. This was a private lake that had been in my family for 3 generations, and the property deed made that crystal clear. A woman in her mid-50s stood at the edge of the dock, clipboard in hand. Authority radiated off her. She had that particular brand of arrogance that comes from having money and thinking it makes you better than everyone else around you. The kind of person who talks to service workers like they're beneath her and acts like the world should revolve around her personal convenience. I decided to handle this like a reasonable adult. I walked around the lake to where the construction was happening, introduced myself politely, and asked what exactly was going on. She looked at me like I was some kind of peasant who had dared to interrupt her royal planning session. "This is community waterfront now, sweetie," she said in that condescending tone that immediately made my blood pressure spike. "I'm just making it beautiful for everyone to enjoy." I took a deep breath and explained that this was actually my family's private lake and that she didn't have permission to build anything that extended into the water. Her response? She laughed, actually laughed at that out loud, like I just told her the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "You're mistaken. This dock has all the paperwork it needs. It's been approved by the HOA. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone involved." The way she said everyone made it clear she was only thinking about one person, and that person definitely wasn't me. There was one witness to this conversation who turned out to be crucial later on. Rachel Doyle lived in a small cottage about halfway between my place and the construction site. She was a retired teacher, maybe 60 years old, who kept to herself most of the time, but had always been friendly when our paths crossed. After the woman dismissed me and went back to her planning, Rachel quietly walked over and pulled me aside. "I saw her burning some official papers last week," she whispered, glancing around to make sure the woman couldn't hear us. "Looked like government notices or something important. The flames were green, like the kind you get when you burn official documents with special ink." I wasn't sure what to make of that information at the time, but I filed it away in the back of my mind. Rachel struck me as the kind of person who noticed details and didn't make up stories for attention. As I walked back to my house that afternoon, I stood at the edge of my property, watching that dock growing longer and longer into my lake. The construction crew was working fast, like they were trying to get as much done as possible before anyone could stop them. I kept thinking about what the woman had said about community waterfront and HOA approval. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. She'd basically told me to my face that she was taking over my family's lake, and there wasn't anything I could do about it. Only one thought was running through my mind as I watched those workers hammer away at their illegal project. She might think she's already won this fight, but I honestly didn't know if I should play by the rules and try to handle this through proper legal channels, or if I should start playing by my own rules instead. But as I walked back up to my cabin, a terrible thought wormed its way in. What if she was right? I spent the next few days digging through every piece of paperwork related to my inheritance, researching water ownership rights, and trying to understand exactly what legal protections I had. The good news was that the documentation was crystal clear. The lake, including all water rights and everything extending out to the center point, belonged to me. Period. There was no ambiguity, no shared ownership, no community access provision. It was as private property gets. I spent the morning mapping the shoreline, marking landmarks, capturing angles, tracing boundaries, like I was prepping for a legal siege. At first, I felt like a cranky old man chasing shadows. But the more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Someone was betting I'd stay quiet. Armed with this information, I decided to give the woman one more chance to be reasonable. I wrote her a very polite letter, included copies of all the relevant legal documents, and explained that while I understood she'd invested in lakefront property, the dock she was building extended into water that belonged to me. I requested that she stop construction immediately and work with me to find a solution that didn't involve trespassing on my property. I even offered to discuss some kind of limited access arrangement if she was willing to approach this respectfully. I thought I was being incredibly generous, considering she'd basically stolen part of my lake without asking, but I should have known better. Instead of a reasonable response, what I got back was a letter from her lawyer. Not just any lawyer either, but some expensive firm from the city, with letterhead that probably cost more to print than most people spend on groceries in a month. The content of that letter was absolutely unbelievable. They were accusing me of harassment and making threatening statements toward their client. They claimed that my aggressive approach and intimidating behavior had caused their client severe emotional distress and anxiety. Get this, they were demanding $20,000 in compensation for the psychological trauma I had allegedly inflicted on her by politely asking her to stop building on my property. I must have read that letter 3 times before the full absurdity of it sank in. Seriously, I'm the one causing anxiety here. The woman who woke me up with heavy machinery and is literally stealing my lake is claiming that I'm the problem. I remember sitting in my kitchen, staring at that letter, wondering if I was living in some kind of alternate reality where up is down and black is white. But she wasn't done escalating things. Over the next week, she launched what I can only describe as a campaign of harassment designed to make my life as miserable as possible. She started by putting up private property no trespassing signs all along the shoreline, including sections that were clearly on my land according to the survey markers. When I called to point this out, she claimed that there must be some mistake with the property lines. Then she hired a private security company to patrol the area. These weren't just any rent-a-cops either. She'd hired the kind of security guards you see at concerts and political events, big intimidating guys who wore tactical gear and acted like they were protecting state secrets instead of an illegal dock project. They started stopping me every time I tried to access my own lake, demanding identification and asking what my business was on the property. As I was filming the second stretch of shoreline, a dark SUV pulled up. Tinted windows. It didn't stay long, but the message was clear enough. Someone was watching, and they wanted me to know it. The final straw came when she filed false reports with the local police claiming that I was stalking her. Never mind that she was the one who had invaded my space and was now preventing me from enjoying my own property. According to her version of events, I was some kind of dangerous obsessive who couldn't accept that she had every right to build whatever she wanted wherever she wanted to build it. The police, to their credit, didn't take her complaints too seriously after they came out and saw the situation for themselves. But the fact that she was willing to lie to law enforcement just to make my life difficult told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person I was dealing with. This wasn't someone who was going to be reasonable or willing to compromise. This was someone who viewed any challenge to her authority as a personal attack that needed to be crushed completely. That's when I realized this had become a war. I'd tried being nice, I'd tried being reasonable, and I'd tried appealing to her sense of fairness and basic human decency. None of that had worked, In fact, it had only seemed to make her more aggressive and more determined to steamroll right over me. "Okay," I said out loud to my empty kitchen. "You want to play hardball? I tried being the good neighbor here. Now we're going to do this the hard way." I wasn't sure exactly what the hard way was going to look like yet, but I knew I wasn't going to just roll over and let her steal my family's lake. My grandfather had worked his whole life to buy this property and pass it down to future generations. I wasn't about to let some entitled woman take it away. As I dug deeper into the construction records and permit documentation, I discovered something interesting. In all of her building permits, the section about waterfront construction consent was completely blank. Not filled out incorrectly, not filed under the wrong category, just blank. Like someone had either forgotten to complete that part of the application or had deliberately left it empty, hoping nobody would notice. This seemed like the kind of detail that could be important, but I wasn't sure exactly how to use it yet. I knew I needed professional help if I was going to fight someone with her resources and connections. That night, I double-checked the locks. I wasn't afraid, just alert, like something had shifted. Rachel turned out to be more helpful than I'd initially realized. A few days after our first conversation, she knocked on my door with a concerned expression and some additional information that changed my understanding of the whole situation. "I've been thinking about what I saw," she said, settling into a chair on my porch with a cup of coffee. It wasn't just that she was burning papers. I heard her on the phone around the same time, and she was arguing with someone about missing permits. She actually shouted something like, "Just build it, I'll handle the paperwork later," loud enough that I could hear it from my garden. This was exactly the kind of information I needed. Rachel had witnessed her essentially admitting that she was proceeding with construction without proper authorization. "I didn't want to get involved initially," Rachel continued, "but watching how she's been treating you, I think someone needs to stand up to her. She's been rude to everyone in the area, acting like she owns the whole lake, just because she bought one piece of property next to it." I decided to dig deeper into the real estate transaction that had brought this woman to our quiet corner of the world in the first place. This time, I wasn't just documenting. I filed a formal property boundary complaint, cited state statutes, sent GPS coordinates with overlays. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. The company that had sold her the lakefront property was called Premier Waterfront Properties, and they had a very specific business model that bordered on fraudulent. They specialized in selling waterfront land to wealthy buyers from the city, making all kinds of promises about lake access and development rights that they couldn't actually deliver on. Their standard practice was to complete the sale, first collect their commission, and then leave the new property owners to figure out the permit and legal issues on their own. In her case, it appeared that Premier had strongly implied she'd be able to build whatever kind of dock she wanted, without mentioning the small detail that she'd need consent from the actual lake owner, namely me, to build anything that extended into the water. I reached out to the county office and a clerk let something slip. She had filed for a dock permit, but it was still pending, never finalized. The more I learned about her situation, the more I realized she was partially a victim of her own arrogance and the real estate company's deceptive practices. She'd been sold a bill of goods by Premier Waterfront Properties, but instead of admitting she'd made a mistake and trying to work things out properly, she'd decided to bulldoze ahead with her plans and deal with any opposition through intimidation and legal threats. It was like she'd convinced herself that if she acted confident enough and threw enough money around, she could retroactively make her illegal dock project legitimate. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the security guards, the false police reports, and the general attitude that my property rights didn't matter as long as she got what she wanted. Feeling the pressure from my polite but persistent questions about permits and legal documentation, she started making increasingly desperate moves to try to end the conflict on her terms. First, she tried bribery, though she was smart enough not to call it that. She showed up at my house one evening with a bottle of expensive wine and a proposal that she clearly thought I couldn't refuse. "Let's be neighbors," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll even name the dock after your grandfather, the Harold McAllister Memorial Pier. Doesn't that sound nice?" When I explained that naming rights weren't the issue and that she still needed my permission to build on my property, her friendly facade disappeared instantly. "You're making a big mistake here," she said, her voice taking on that cold, threatening tone I was getting used to. "I have connections you can't even imagine. People who could make your life very complicated if you keep pushing this." I honestly couldn't believe she was threatening me while standing on my own front porch, but there she was doing exactly that. I realized that this conflict had grown beyond just a property dispute. This was about standing up to the kind of person who thinks money and connections put them above the law and basic human decency. I started documenting everything systematically. Every conversation, every interaction, every piece of construction activity got photographed, recorded, and filed away. I bought a decent camera with a telephoto lens and started taking daily photos of the dock construction progress, making sure to timestamp everything. My jaw locked so hard I felt it crack. I wasn't angry, I was boiling, contained for now. I kept detailed logs of the noise levels, the working hours, and any environmental damage I could observe. I sent formal complaints to every relevant county office I could think of, from the building department to the Environmental Protection Agency to the Water Management District. Most of these complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, but I kept sending them anyway, creating a paper trail that might be useful later. The thing that really struck me during this period was how isolated she had made herself in the community. She'd been so focused on bulldozing through any opposition that she'd alienated pretty much everyone in the area. The construction crews were afraid of her, the local officials were tired of her demands and attitude, and even the neighbors who might have been sympathetic to her situation had been put off by her approach. But to beat someone like her, someone with resources and connections and a willingness to fight dirty, I knew I was going to need more than just documentation and community sympathy. I was going to need professional help. The question was whether I was ready to take this to that level. Did I really want to spend potentially years of my life and thousands of dollars in legal fees fighting over a dock? Was it worth it just to prove a point about property rights? Looking back now, I should have known the answer to that question. But at the time, I kept going back and forth. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was still some way to work this out without turning it into a major legal battle. I printed the email thread and slipped it into a folder. If she wanted a war, I'd bring fire and paperwork. I knew I needed professional help, but finding the right lawyer for this kind of case wasn't as simple as just picking a name out of the phone book. I needed someone who specialized in property disputes, someone who understood water rights, and ideally someone who had experience dealing with difficult personalities like the woman across the lake. After asking around and doing some research online, I was referred to Russell Briggs, a lawyer about 60-something years old, who'd built his entire practice around land disputes and HOA conflicts. His office was in a converted Victorian house about an hour away from the lake, and from the moment I walked in, I could tell this was someone who understood exactly the kind of situation I was dealing with. The walls were covered with framed newspaper articles about cases he'd won, and there were stacks of legal documents everywhere that suggested he stayed very busy with this type of work. Russell reviewed all my documentation with the kind of methodical attention to detail that made me feel like I'd finally found someone who took this seriously. He spread out my property deeds, the construction permits, the photographs, and all my correspondence across a large conference table and spent almost an hour going through everything piece by piece. "Son," he finally said, leaning back in his chair and shaking his head, "you've got what we call a slam dunk case here. She's building on your property without permission, she's ignored multiple official notices, and her permits are incomplete. Any one of these issues would be enough to win in court. All three together, this shouldn't even make it to trial." But then he looked at me seriously and added, "But you need to be prepared for her to fight dirty. People like this don't go down quietly, and she's going to do everything she can to make this as expensive and unpleasant as possible for you." Russell's legal strategy was refreshingly straightforward. "We've got 3 separate angles of attack," he explained, drawing diagrams on a legal pad to illustrate his points. "First, she's building on your property without consent, which is textbook trespassing and property damage. Second, she's violated multiple county regulations by ignoring official notices and proceeding with construction that doesn't meet permit requirements. The third, her permits are incomplete in the waterfront construction section, which means the county should never have approved the project in the first place." He estimated that a cease and desist letter from his office would probably be enough to stop the construction, and that we could likely get a court order for removal of the dock without having to go through a lengthy trial process. "The law is completely on your side here," he said. "The only question is whether she's smart enough to recognize that and back down, or if she's going to force us to go through the whole legal process." Russell sent an official cease and desist letter that was a thing of beauty. Gone was any pretense of friendliness or willingness to compromise. This was a formal legal document that laid out exactly what she had done wrong, what the consequences would be if she didn't stop immediately, and what kind of financial penalties she was looking at if we had to take this to court. The language was precise, professional, and completely unambiguous. Cease all construction activities immediately. Remove all structures extending into the lake. Restore the shoreline to its original condition. Failure to comply within 7 days will result in court action seeking injunctive relief, monetary damages, and recovery of all legal costs. I have to admit I felt a little thrill reading that letter. After weeks of being threatened and intimidated, it felt good to finally be the one making demands backed up by the law. Would you take the settlement or fight to the end if you were me? But instead of backing down, Joanne was back with backup. 3 men in expensive suits stood beside her at the end of the dock, all of them carrying briefcases and looking like they meant business. She'd apparently decided that if one lawyer wasn't enough to intimidate me, she'd bring an entire legal team. "Everything's been reviewed and authorized," she called out across the water. "Maybe you just didn't read the bylaws closely enough?" One of the men quietly slid an envelope toward me, a cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal team. "You've been formally notified," he said in a flat professional tone. "Any interference with the dock will be treated as vandalism." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were actually trying to turn this around and make me the bad guy. Word about our legal battle started spreading through the local community, mostly through social media groups where neighbors shared information about local issues. The response was overwhelmingly supportive of my position, with lots of people sharing their own stories about HOA overreach and property disputes. Several people mentioned that they'd had negative interactions with Joanne since she'd moved to the area, and there seemed to be a general feeling that someone finally standing up to her was long overdue. The attention made Joanne even more uncomfortable than the legal pressure. She was used to being able to intimidate people in private, but having her behavior discussed publicly was clearly something she hadn't anticipated. Rachel called that night. She'd overheard Joanne yelling at someone on speaker. "I don't care what the zoning map says, just stall him." I noticed that the construction work slowed down significantly after the cease and desist letter arrived, and the security guards disappeared entirely. Whether that was because her lawyer had advised her to stop, or because she was running out of money to pay them, I wasn't sure. Russell warned me that this was probably the calm before the storm. "She's going to get more aggressive now," he predicted. "People like her don't go down quietly, and she's probably consulting with other lawyers right now, trying to find some angle of attack we haven't considered." He was absolutely right. The next morning, I woke up to find my mailbox had been smashed with what looked like a baseball bat, and there were tire tracks across my front lawn that definitely hadn't been there the night before. Nothing that could be directly traced back to Joanne, of course, but the message was clear enough. She wanted me to know that legal action wasn't going to stop her from making my life difficult. I took photos of the damage and added them to my growing file of documentation. If she wanted to escalate things beyond the legal system, I was ready for that too. But I couldn't help wondering, was this just the beginning, and what exactly was she planning to do next? The next morning, there was a letter on my deck. The HOA accused me of trespassing on my own shoreline. The local media attention started almost by accident. A young journalist named Sean Everett had seen the discussions about our dispute in some of the community social media groups and thought it might make for an interesting human interest story. Sean was maybe 30 years old, worked for the regional newspaper, and had that hungry look that young reporters get when they smell a good story. He approached me one afternoon while I was taking my daily documentation photos of the dock construction, introduced himself, and asked if I'd be willing to talk about what was happening. "This sounds like a classic David versus Goliath situation," he said, "and I think people would be interested in hearing your side of the story. Would you mind if I wrote an article about this?" I wasn't sure how I felt about media attention, but I figured it couldn't hurt to have the facts out there publicly. Maybe if people understood what was really happening, it would put additional pressure on Joanne to do the right thing. Before the article could even be written, though, Joanne tried to control the narrative by going directly to Sean's editor. She didn't know that Sean had already mentioned his interest in the story to me, so I heard about her interference almost immediately. Apparently, she'd called the newspaper office and made it very clear that her HOA was a major advertiser with the paper and that it would be unfortunate if they ran a story that painted her in a negative light. I caught myself pacing in circles, muttering legal codes under my breath like prayers. I'd hate to see our advertising relationship affected by poor editorial decisions, she'd told the editor, according to what Sean reported back to me. Maybe your reporter should focus on more positive community stories instead of stirring up unnecessary drama. I couldn't believe the audacity. She was trying to use her advertising dollars to suppress a news story about her own illegal activity. That seemed like the kind of thing that would backfire spectacularly, and I was right. Sean's editor, to his credit, didn't take kindly to being threatened by an advertiser. He told Sean to proceed with the story and to make sure it was thorough and well documented. I filed a formal notice of non-compliance with the Department of Natural Resources citing illegal shoreline modification. The article that ran a few days later was everything I could have hoped for. The headline read, "Local Man Fights HOA President Over Family Lake," and the story laid out all the facts in clear, objective language that made it obvious who was in the wrong here. Sean had done his homework interviewing several people in the community, reviewing the legal documents, and even getting photos of the dock construction in progress. The article mentioned Joanne's attempt to suppress the story, which made her look even worse. Mrs. Carlisle declined to comment for this article. The piece concluded, but did contact this newspaper's advertising department to express concerns about coverage of the dispute. I planted a sign at the end of the dock, "Unauthorized structure under review." If nothing else, it rattled them. The response from readers was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive of my position. The online comments section filled up with people sharing their own stories about HOA overreach and property disputes. "This is exactly why people hate HOAs," wrote one commenter. "They think they can do whatever they want to other people's property." Another person added, "Good for this guy for standing up to her. Someone needs to put these HOA bullies in their place." And there were dozens of similar comments, and several people mentioned that they'd had negative experiences with Joanne personally since she'd moved to the area. Reading through all that support was incredibly validating. For the first time, I wondered if I was being naive, thinking logic would win against people like her. The media attention had an unexpected effect on Joanne's behavior. She seemed to completely lose her composure when faced with public scrutiny of her actions. A few days after the article ran, I was doing some grocery shopping in town when she approached me in the parking lot, clearly agitated and not thinking clearly about who might be watching. "You're ruining my reputation over a stupid lake," she shouted loud enough that other shoppers stopped to stare. "I've invested everything in this project, and you're destroying me with your lies and your media games." And I tried to stay calm and just told her that if she didn't want negative publicity, maybe she shouldn't have built illegally on other people's property, but she was beyond listening to reason at that point. A neighbor had offered to help earlier that week, saying he hated the HOA and their tactics too. But later that night, I saw his truck parked beside Joanne's garage. What Joanne didn't know was that Rachel happened to be in the parking lot at the same time and had started recording the confrontation on her phone as soon as she heard raised voices. The video showed Joanne looking completely unhinged, shouting at me, while I stood there calmly trying to de-escalate the situation. You could see other shoppers backing away from her, clearly uncomfortable with her behavior. When Rachel posted the video online with the caption, "HOA President Loses It Over Lake Dispute," it got shared hundreds of times within the first few hours. The comments were even more brutal than the ones on the newspaper article. "This woman is clearly unstable," wrote one person. "She should not be in charge of anyone's homeowners association." Another commenter added, "Look how calm he stays while she's screaming at him. That tells you everything you need to know about who's in the wrong here." With my engineering background, I'd been paying attention to more than just the legal aspects of the dock construction. The whole project looked rushed and poorly planned, like they were cutting corners to get it finished as quickly as possible. The foundation pilings looked insufficient for the kind of weather we get during storm season, and the overall structure didn't seem to meet the building codes I was familiar with. I sent an email to the county building inspector expressing my concerns. "The foundation pilings appear insufficient for winter storm conditions," I wrote. "This structure could be dangerous to both the builders and anyone who uses it once it's completed. I recommend a thorough engineering inspection before any additional work is done." The inspector replied that they'd look into it, but that any formal inspection would have to be requested by the property owner. Of course, Joanne wasn't about to request an inspection that might shut down her project. As summer moved toward fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that storm season was going to play a role in how this whole situation resolved itself. That night, the wind picked up. Something told me we were past permits now. The legal pressure was finally starting to have some real impact. After weeks of formal complaints and documentation, the county building department finally responded with a formal investigation of the dock project. An inspector came out to the site, spent several hours examining the construction, and found multiple violations of building codes and permit requirements. Joanne received an official notice that read, "Cease construction immediately pending compliance review and resolution of permit discrepancies." The notice was posted prominently on the construction site, and work stopped completely for the first time since this whole mess had started. You'd think that would have been the end of it, but Joanne's response was to hire an expensive lawyer from the city to fight the county's enforcement action. She was apparently determined to turn this into a battle against everyone, not just me. Even her own HOA members were starting to question her judgment by this point. Rachel had attended one of their monthly meetings and reported back that there was significant dissent in the ranks. At what was supposed to be a routine discussion of community maintenance issues, one resident had stood up and said, "Joanne, this lake situation is becoming an embarrassment to our entire community. It's all anyone talks about, and it's making us look bad. Why don't you just take down the dock and move on?" According to Rachel, Joanne's response was to shut down discussion of the topic entirely and threaten to fine anyone who brought it up again. "This is an internal HOA matter," she'd said, "and anyone who doesn't support the board's decisions is welcome to move somewhere else." It was exactly the kind of response that turned potential allies into enemies, and her support within the HOA was crumbling rapidly. Within 24 hours, a local blog ran the headline, "HOA dock encroaches on private lake." I didn't expect much until the post got picked up by a regional news station. Comments flooded in. By morning, a dozen kayaks paddled out just to see the dock in person. One guy live-streamed the whole shoreline, narrating like a true crime doc. Realizing that her legal and political options were running out, Joanne made one final desperate attempt to resolve the situation on her terms. She showed up at my house on a Sunday morning, looking quite different from the arrogant, perfectly dressed woman I'd first encountered months earlier. She looked tired, stressed, and for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely vulnerable. "Wyatt, please," she said, and there was none of the usual condescension in her voice. "I've invested everything I have in this project. The cabin, the dock, all of it. I can't afford to lose it all now. What will it take to make this work for both of us?" When I told her the same thing I'd been saying from the beginning, that she needed to remove the dock, restore my shoreline, and apologize publicly for what she'd done, she looked like I'd asked her to cut off her own arm. "I can't do that," she said quietly. "It would ruin me financially and destroy my reputation completely. There has to be some other way." The weather forecast that week was dominated by news of a major storm system developing off the coast. The meteorologists were calling it a perfect storm situation, with conditions that could produce sustained winds of up to 70 miles per hour, and storm surge that could affect areas well inland from the coast. Residents near bodies of water are advised to secure any loose structures or outdoor furniture, the Weather Service warned. This storm has the potential to cause significant property damage, especially to structures that are not properly anchored or up to current building codes. You'd think I'd feel victorious. But truth is, I was exhausted. Paranoia had taken root. If they could twist my own shoreline into public space, what else could they flip? I thought immediately about those inadequate foundation pilings I'd been worried about, and about the engineering concerns I'd raised with the county inspector months earlier. This was exactly the kind of weather event that exposed poor construction decisions. I decided to make one final attempt to prevent what I was increasingly certain was going to be a disaster. I sent one last email to Joanne and the county. "The dock structure is not rated for severe weather. Recommend immediate removal or reinforcement before storm hits." Joanne ignored it. "County says we can't force action during pending litigation. If you were me, would you try to save the dock or let nature decide?" Rachel texted me a clip she recorded at an HOA meeting. Joanne's voice clipped and cold. "If the permit's not valid, I don't care. We just need 2 more weeks and a storm. That'll solve our problem for us." The storm hit on a Tuesday night in late September, and it was every bit as severe as the meteorologists had predicted. I'd spent the day securing everything on my own property, but there wasn't much I could do except ride it out and hope for the best. The wind started picking up around dinner time, and by midnight it was howling like something out of a horror movie. Rain was coming down in sheets, hitting the windows so hard I thought they might break. I could hear trees falling in the distance, and the power went out around 2 in the morning. But the worst part was the sound coming from the lake. The waves were enormous, bigger than I'd ever seen them, and they were pounding against the shoreline with incredible force. Every few minutes I'd hear a loud crack or groan that I was pretty sure was coming from the direction of Joanne's dock. Mother Nature's about to settle this dispute for us, I remember thinking as I listened to the storm tear through our area. At around 3 in the morning, I heard a sound that was different from all the others. It was a loud, prolonged creak, followed by what sounded like a massive piece of wood snapping in half. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window that faced toward the dock, but the rain was too heavy and the darkness too complete to see anything clearly. I could make out the general shape of the structure, and it looked like it was still there, but something was definitely wrong. The whole thing seemed to be moving in a way that it shouldn't have been moving, swaying and shifting with each wave, in a way that suggested the foundation anchors were no longer holding properly. I stood there for probably 20 minutes, trying to see what was happening through the storm, wondering if this was finally going to be the end of Joanne's illegal dock project. Looking back now, I should have known that when Mother Nature decides to get involved in human disputes, she doesn't mess around. The question wasn't whether the dock was going to survive the storm. The question was what would be left of it when the sun came up. I stood on the porch as clouds rolled over the lake. Joanne's dock groaned against the waves. A storm was coming, and this time it felt personal. When dawn finally broke and the storm moved on, I walked down to the shoreline to assess the damage, and what I saw was so unbelievable that I actually stood there for several minutes just staring before my brain could process what had happened. The entire dock had broken free from its moorings and was now floating in the middle of the lake like some kind of massive, very expensive piece of driftwood. The $500,000 structure that Joanne had been so determined to keep was now bobbing gently in the water, completely detached from the shore, and drifting slowly toward the outlet stream that connected my lake to the river system. "Oh my goodness," I said out loud to nobody in particular. "It actually happened." Pieces of decking and railing were scattered across the lake surface, and what looked like outdoor furniture was floating among the debris. The whole scene looked like the aftermath of a maritime disaster, except instead of a ship that had sunk, it was a dock that had decided to become a very confused houseboat. That afternoon, I untied the faded mooring rope holding the dock to a rusted post. I didn't push it, didn't sabotage it. I just let it rest loose. Let gravity and weather decide. At dawn, the dock was gone, just driftwood patterns on the surface. Joanne arrived 30 minutes later in full panic mode, heels sinking into mud, yelling into her phone. Someone filmed her from a canoe. The video was titled "Queen of the HOA Loses Her Throne." 40,000 views in 2 hours. Joanne arrived about an hour later, still in her pajamas, with her hair disheveled, and the sound she made when she saw her floating dock was something between a scream and a wail. "What did you do?" she shouted at me, as if I had somehow personally caused the storm that had torn her illegally built structure away from its inadequate foundation. "What did you do to my dock?" I tried to explain as calmly as I could manage that I hadn't done anything except watch nature take its course, and that I'd actually warned both her and the counties about the structural problems weeks before the storm hit. "I warned you about the foundation," I told her. "I said those pilings weren't rated for severe weather. You chose to ignore the warning." But she was beyond rational conversation at that point. "You sabotaged it," she kept screaming. "You destroyed my life. You planned this whole thing." I honestly felt a little sorry for her, watching her dreams literally floating away. But I couldn't forget all the months of harassment threats and illegal construction that had led to this moment. The county building inspector arrived later that morning to assess the storm damage, and his conclusions were both predictable and damning. After examining the broken foundation points where the dock had separated from its moorings, he confirmed what I'd been saying all along. "Ma'am, this was clear structural failure due to inadequate engineering," he told Joanne. "The anchor points weren't rated for the kind of stress this storm generated. We have multiple warnings about this issue in our files, including correspondence from the adjacent property owner." He showed her copies of my emails and formal complaints, all of which had predicted exactly what had just happened. "The building codes exist for a reason," he continued. "This structure should never have been approved with the foundation system that was installed." Joanne just stood there staring at the floating remains of her investment, occasionally letting out little whimpering sounds like a wounded animal. By mid-morning, the local fire department had arrived to assess whether the floating dock posed any kind of safety hazard or navigation problem. After conferring with county officials and consulting some kind of marine salvage regulations, they declared that retrieval would be too dangerous and costly to attempt. Since the dock was now in the public waterway that connected to the river system, it was classified as marine debris and became the responsibility of whoever owned the waterway, which definitely wasn't Joanne. The local news helicopter that had been covering storm damage throughout the region got some incredible aerial footage of the whole spectacle. Rachel stood beside me with her phone raised. "They're watching live," she whispered. I didn't smile, but I did not look away either. I watched the coverage that evening, and seeing that massive structure floating down the river like a lost barge was both surreal and oddly satisfying. The news anchor described it as a $1 million dock that became a floating disaster after breaking free during last night's storm. They interviewed some boaters downstream who were concerned about navigation hazards, but nobody seemed particularly sympathetic to Joanne's situation. With the dock literally gone and multiple building code violations thoroughly documented, Joanne's legal position collapsed completely. Russell explained that she was now looking at massive fines for illegal construction cleanup costs, for debris removal, potential lawsuits from downstream property owners who might suffer damage from her floating dock, and the complete loss of her investment in the structure itself. "She's financially ruined," he told me during a phone call later that week. "The county is hitting her with $60,000 in violation fines. Her expensive city lawyer quit when she couldn't pay his bills, and she's got potential liability for anything that dock hits on its way to the ocean." It turned out that when you build illegal structures with inadequate engineering, and those structures cause problems for other people, you're responsible for all the consequences. Who could have predicted that, within 2 weeks of the storm, a for sale sign appeared in front of Joanne's unfinished cabin? The asking price started high but dropped 3 times over the following month, as she became increasingly desperate to escape the financial and legal consequences of her actions. I watched from across the lake as moving trucks came and went, loading up what was left of her dream of lakefront living. The day she finally left for good, I saw her standing by the empty foundation posts where her dock used to be attached, just staring out at the water, where her $500,000 investment had last been seen. For a moment, I actually felt a little sorry for her. She'd made a series of terrible decisions, but watching someone's dreams literally float away was still a sad thing to witness. Rachel walked over while I was watching Joanne's final departure and asked, "Think she learned her lesson?" I thought about it for a minute and then shook my head. Doubt it. People like Joanne never think they're wrong. They just think they got unlucky. But as her moving truck disappeared down the road for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete peace and quiet. I'm standing by my lake right now as I finish telling you this story, watching the sunset paint the water gold and listening to the gentle sounds of nature that I'd missed so much during all those months of construction noise and legal battles. There are no more bulldozers, no more security guards, no more threatening letters, and definitely no more Karen energy poisoning my sanctuary. The shoreline has been restored to its natural state, and the only boats on my lake are the ones I choose to put there myself. Did I destroy Joanne's dock? Technically, no. Mother Nature handled that part all by herself. Did I warn everyone involved that the structure was going to fail in bad weather? Absolutely, and I have the documentation to prove it. Do I feel bad about watching her dreams float away down the river toward the Atlantic Ocean? Joanne's cabin stood untouched, but her dock, her pride, her illusion of control, it was out to sea. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. A little bit, but not enough to regret standing up for my property rights and my family's legacy. Sometimes bullies need to learn that actions have consequences, and sometimes Mother Nature is the best teacher of all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but just letting people destroy themselves with their own poor decisions and arrogant behavior. That dock probably made it all the way to the ocean by now. And somewhere out there, some very confused fish are wondering why their neighborhood suddenly has a $500,000 artificial reef. And me, well, I'm right where I belong, finally enjoying the peace and quiet of my lake just the way it was meant to be. Later that night, I sat by the shore, the mist rolling in and the soft drip of rain from an empty post, the only sound. After everything that happened, it felt calming. Maybe the real lesson here is sometimes standing up for what's yours doesn't need a dramatic ending. Nature takes care of the rest. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. And if you liked this story, don't forget to hit that thanks button to support the channel. Catch you in the next one.
Thanks for riding the emotional roller coaster with QA Stories. Buckle up, the next one's even twistier.